Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Yes, we're going to talk about the B2 and managing them with posterior augmented anatomic glenoid. And I cannot advance at this point. I know we got to wait, but there we go. All right, this is my disclosure. So we know that B2 glenoids are difficult to manage. Generally, their functional results have been worse. Glenoid loosening rates higher, failure rates higher. So much so that many surgeons have given up and actually just doing a reverse shoulder on many of these. So this is what we're talking about. It's the biconcave glenoid, where the humeral head is fixed in posteriorly and wearing away the glenoid. So what are your treatment options? You can do eccentric reaming, bone grafting, leaving the glenoid retroverted, which John just showed a second ago, augmented glenoids, and then, of course, the reverse shoulder with or without bone graft. The operation is technically tough. You got to get the humeral head more out of the way because the glenoid is actually facing away from the surgeon, and that may be another reason why they haven't done quite as well. So the question is, and we're going to try to answer today, is if you compare augmented glenoid, in this case it's the full wedge, it's what I have the most experience with, to non-augmented glenoid, in theory, the augmented glenoid should do worse. Now these are all B2 on the left, and on the right, there may have been a few B2s, but mostly non-B2 glenoids. So our current treatment, ream the high side, relatively easy to do. The downside is you give up the best bone in the glenoid, the subchondral bone. You have to downside your glenoid, and you end up losing that good bone. And so if you watch these glenoids over time, they immediately migrate. So they're technically loose. You can use posterior bone grafting. There's a couple of small studies that show that that works. It's technically hard, and cement and bone healing not necessarily go hand in hand. And then, of course, reverse or bone graft. Reverse works really quite well with bone graft, but not so much anatomic, which is what we're focusing on. So what we have is on your left, the A, and what we're doing with eccentric reaming is C and D in order to correct the version. So you give up a lot of good real estate, the best bone in the glenoid. And this is what you get. You get a glenoid you can see through, cancellous bone, and peg perforation, loss of subchondral support. You have to downsize your implant, your Walch shrinks. So not many good things. So how much can you correct by eccentric reaming? It turns out to be about 12 degrees. So you can't correct a huge amount, but you certainly can correct some by eccentric reaming. So what about just leaving the glenoid retroverted? We have looked at that, and you're looking at finite element analysis. After about 10 degrees, the FEA, if you look at it, the black posteriorly gets so high that the bone cement interface really will not hold up based on this study. So can we do better? And the question really is, can we do better? And that's where we came along with the posterior augmented glenoids. We wanted to minimize reaming and save that very good bone. We wanted to eliminate the need for bone graft. We wanted to rebalance the joint and send the forces, direct the forces down the glenoid neck and complete shear forces into compressive forces. And so the history behind this actually goes back to the 1990s with Smith and Nephew and Bob Cofield, who had a augmented glenoid. It's been discontinued. It was actually augmented on the articular side. One study out on it by Wright said, oh, actually the results weren't all that bad, but that has no longer been in circulation. DePuy came out in 2009 with a step to manage this. Exactech came out with a full wedge in early 2011. To date, about 4,000 of these have been placed. And to date, actually over a third now are of anatomic glenoids placed with this full wedge are done. And that's driven by navigation, as John Levy would show you really in that last talk, is as you start navigating these, you realize that the retroversion is much worse than you thought. And then Tournier had the half wedge. So the full wedge the idea is that the correction is on the bony side, not the articular side. So you direct the forces down the glenoid neck. The step makes a step in the glenoid that breaks up the downhill shear forces. And then the half wedge by Tournier Wright striker. And so here's what's happening here. A is the desired state, B is where you don't want to leave it, and C is what you're doing with an augmented glenoid. Roche looked at joint line. If you want to maintain the joint line, eccentric reaming is not the way to do it. You need to do it with an augment. If you look at FEA stuff, if you leave a glenoid retroverted, it is much worse than using a posterior augmented glenoid. It wasn't even close in this study by Hermida. If you look at bone preservation, Christine showed that using a wedge glenoid, you save much bone, a lot of bone as compared to eccentric reaming. And this was further explored by Allred, which also showed there was bone preservation by using a full wedge. So we first reported on these about 6 years ago with a small study of 24 patients. And what we really wanted to look at was, did they do okay? And this is short term. And did they stay centered? In reality, in this short study, it did stay centered went that way. Here is, to make things a little bit more complicated, now you have the opportunity to use biocomposites as well, which may have an advantage of bone on growth as opposed to cement alone, although time will tell. So here's what you're doing with eccentric reaming. You are, which is the far right. That's what you do with eccentric reaming. If you look at the second one, this is where you're reaming for a wedge. You're just trying to flatten the glenoid. So today we've done about 200 shoulders at the University of Florida, with the first one put in as a prototype in 2020. Recently, we did a age, sex, and match and diagnosis match, comparing the two results of augmented versus non-augmented. So the posterior augmented glenoids are on the bottom row, and for all these outcome measures, we found no difference, even though you would have thought that they would do worse, but at this stage they have not. What about lucent lines? Slightly higher lucent line ratio with the augments, but this was not statistically significant in this group. And with using the biocomposites, we've shown already that the lucent line ratio drops by 1/3. So what about keeping them centered now with all these? If you look at the bottom, the axillary laterals, which is key, 37 of them remain centered, 3 of them anteriorly subluxated. The important thing is none of them, despite many naysayers, have posteriorly subluxated. So we looked at a larger study more recently, about 120, and we found that when using a posterior augmented, 90% of them reached MCID for both range of motion and functional outcomes. And this is actually this year, Sean Gray reported on 4-year average follow-up using the posterior augments. Again, 90% of patients reach MCID for functional outcomes and range of motion with a radiolucent line score of about 1/3. So in conclusion, and this is really moving on to midterm now, we've shown that posterior augments do improve range of motion, 90% get MCID. They get improved function, again, 90% get MCID. We are not finding the posterior subluxation of the humeral head on the glenoid to date, and that's been a very, very positive finding. I'm very happy with that. So posterior augment glenoid, it is great for balancing the forces. It saves bone, and it makes the procedure much easier. Thank you.